It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Gearan. For those of you who do not know, Dr. Gearan is an internal medicine specialist who was the residency program director for internal medicine at Maine Medical Center for 15 years before passing the baton. Dr. Gearan has serves as the associate DIO at Maine Medical Center, helping me keep track of the 330 some residents and fellows we have. Dr. Gearan actually has a very unusual background in rural graduate medical education. He was at the helm of starting up the first rural internal medicine track in the country, actually. And the progress was really followed carefully by the ACGME, influencing ACGME policy and probably influencing a little bit, perhaps, how CMS actually thinks about rural GME reimbursement. Dr. Gearan is also has been involved in the Merge Collaborative as one of our rural GME directors with a particular interest in rural GME. So thank you very much for agreeing to do our grand rounds today, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen. Let me just get to... Good. Does that look okay, Callie? Can you? Yes, okay. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you all for your role in education. I hope my voice holds up. August is one of my allergy months, and something comes out in August every year that gets me. But we're going to talk today about optimizing our feedback conversations. First off, here is your CME credit, so you can jot down the code that you would text. I'll pause here for a second while you make a note of that. And if you need this again later, please let us know. Here's our accreditation for our CME. Some information on the app if you're not using the Cloud CME app. That is an easy way to claim your credit. And then here is our disclosure statement. I have no relevant financial relationships with any commercial organizations. So our objectives today, we're going to talk about some relationship-centered communication skills that you can apply to your feedback conversations with learners. We're going to talk about factors that both positively and negatively influence learner perspective of the credibility of our feedback. And we're going to use this to kind of develop an approach to navigating some of the more difficult feedback conversations that we may have. And I always like to kind of start with a outline of competency-based medical education. And this is a paper from Van Mel that talks about the core components of competency-based medical education, and looking the 5 components along the bottom there. We should be looking at outcome competencies that are based on a profile of what our graduates should be able to do in practice. These competencies should be organized in a logical developmental sequence. Learning should take place in settings that model a practice. And then what we're going to be talking about today is, teaching should be individualized to the learner, and learner progression is based on a systematic approach to decision-making, including standards, data collection, interpretation, observation, and feedback. So really, feedback is a very important part of our competency-based medical education system. And it was, as I looked through some of the literature on feedback, is very kind of heartwarming to see the big role that Maine Medical Center has played in a lot of the literature. And here's a paper from back in 2009 from our own Bob Bingu, who's our former DIO, and Bob Trowbridge, who's one of our great medical educators at Tufts and Maine Medical Center. But this paper called Failing at Feedback was really interesting about talking about this disconnect that very common exists between learners and teachers, where we as teachers think we're giving great feedback and frequent feedback, but often learners don't feel like they're getting enough feedback, or the feedback they're getting is not of high quality. And talks about a traditional model where feedback was thought of as unilateral, really emphasized the role of the teacher, and it probably underemphasized the role of the learner in this. and that learners, often struggle in their ability to self-assess. They can have affective reactions to feedback as well. So kind of a summary line from the paper was, an approach to improving feedback incorporates teacher-based behaviors, learner-based cognitive principles, and a focus on the teacher-learner relationship. And this concept of the relationship evolved into another phase of what's known as the Educational Alliance. And this was kind of a spin off of the Therapeutic Alliance concept from psychotherapy and clinical work that really emphasized the effect of the relationship between the teacher and learner on the incorporation of feedback. And it reconceptualized feedback as a bilateral, context-based dialogue. And our own Dr. Veraculis was involved, along with Dr. Bing Yu and others from Maine Medical Center, in another spin on this concept of, likening feedback interaction to a dance partnership. And a paper that they titled The Feedback Tango, but like dance, feedback is complex, it's nonlinear. It depends on trust and emotions and affect, and it really improves with time and practice. So I think it's a very good example. And some of the recommendations from this paper is that feedback should occur within a longitudinal relationship between teachers and students. They even posed the difficult question of, should we limit the number of people that provide feedback, which is sometimes hard to do, but then recommending that we really explore what are the right steps in the feedback exchange, and that feedback takes place also within a culture of an organization, and that faculty development can go a long way to improving that culture. And then this is a paper that from one of my former attendings at Boston University, but it kind of explored a sociocultural model of feedback. And really at the center of this complex exchange is the goal that we're trying to improve learners' performance. But there are multiple factors at play, including the feedback recipient, the feedback provider, and then the institutional factors, the overall culture of feedback. So this is really, it's a complex entity, feedback. And one of the themes that through the feedback literature is that learners don't always incorporate our feedback, or they listen to some of our feedback, or they decide which ones they want to act upon. And really this concept of credibility, and that learners look at our feedback or listen to our feedback through their own credibility filters. And this was a systematic review that looked at studies that describe factors that influence feedback credibility. And it identified 22 articles, and one of them was from Maine Medical Center, Dr. Bing Yu's article from the internal medicine program here in the 90s. Mostly qualitative studies that use interviews and focus group of learners, but it was an interprofessional or multidisciplinary, including medical students, graduate medical education, including medicine, OB, psychiatry, and then nursing programs, veterinary and rehab. And they kind of pulled all this together and identified what are the positive influencers of feedback credibility. The first being the actual characteristics of the feedback, that it's in person, it's done individually, it's done in a timely manner, it's specific and uses objective information, and then that typically more positive feedback is going to be more credible to learners than negative. You look at the factors of the recipients, their motivation and attitudes, their growth mindset, that often learners at lower levels are more open to feedback than learners at higher levels. They actually explored the role of gender, and that female learners were more open to incorporating feedback. We'll leave that there. And then that learners need to trust the source. They need to perceive the sender of the feedback as trustworthy. The source, the fact that the feedback provider is credible as a role model. There's somebody that is enthusiastic about their specialty, that often if there's congruence between the specialties of the teacher and the learner, it's more credible feedback. The motivation of the feedback provider, their intent to teach or help. They're knowledgeable in their field, but also knowledgeable about the learner. They're empathetic and encouraging. And then lastly, that the context of the feedback is done within an alliance, a teacher-learner relationship, ideally of adequate length and quality, that feedback is a priority, and that there is alignment of feedback with learner self-assessment, with goals and expectations and standards. So there's a lot going on, a lot of lenses through which learners can review our feedback. And this was a paper from the psychiatry. This was from a Tilio, and this was from PGY2 and PGY3 psychiatry residents in one program. But this was really very interesting to me, that first impressions really matter. And I just pulled some of the quotes that trainees are making judgments about their supervisor's credibility as a clinician and a role model, but also making judgments regarding the supervisor's investment in the educational alliance. Um, and then the bottom quote there, that the tone of the educational alliance is likely to develop in the mind of the learner very early in the relationship with the supervisor. So it was very interesting to me that this something that we need to tend to right away. So some of my sources for today, I learned this from the Curbsiders Teach podcast, and I put the date there from December of 2021. The guest on that podcast was Dr. Calvin Chu, who's from UCSF. This is part of a book, but also a website, the Academy of Communication and Healthcare. The book is entitled Communication RX. I have no financial stake in the book. It just was their publication, and I think a very interesting read. But the concept here is there's a set of communication methods for patient care that we use. But really, these communication methods for patient care can be applied to other scenarios in healthcare, including feedback, interprofessional collaboration, and conflict. And the three skill sets that they talk about is, the first one is how to begin an encounter. The second being, how do you use skills that build trust? And then third, how do you deliver diagnoses and treatment plans? So just walking through those, the beginning of the encounter, this is things that we do in clinical care, what we seek to do, which is establishing rapport, eliciting the list of concerns, and negotiating a shared agenda. Using skills that build trust, using open-ended questions, listening actively, eliciting the ideas and expectations from patients, or in our case, learners, using statements that display empathy. So they use the mnemonic pearls, but partnering, naming emotions when they're there, apologizing when needed, voicing respect, legitimizing understandable feelings, and offering ongoing support, and using these skills, and then eventually transitioning to further data gathering once we've obtained this information. And then when we deliver diagnoses or treatment plans, they talk about this method called ART, which is ask, respond, and tell. So first ask the patient, or in our case, the learner, for their perspective about a diagnosis. Respond with active listening and empathy, and then share your perspective. So these are, presented as communication skills for clinical work, but let's talk about how we can apply these same communication skills to our feedback conversations. So they use this as a definition of feedback, which I thought was very good: specific, non-judgmental information that compares performance with a standard, given with the intent to improve performance. So if we kind of go back to our systematic review and what makes feedback credible to learners, let's apply our definition here. So specific, that showed up. Non-judgmental information, you see that under source credibility, we have empathetic and encouraging. Comparing performance with a standard, that includes the content of our feedback being objective and specific. It's also aligned with goals and objectives and standards. And then lastly, given with an intent to improve performance, that ties into not only the recipient having a growth mindset, but us as teachers demonstrating the intent to teach or help. So our definition holds up. So they talk about as we approach feedback with learners, the first step is establishing a relationship. And so, very similar to building a therapeutic alliance with a patient, is having a brief conversation the first time you meet the learner, introducing yourself, but also getting to know the learner and what is important to them. What is important to them professionally, and you may also, ask what's important to them personally. What do they do for fun? What are their hobbies? What have they been up to lately? But just demonstrating that, desire to have a connection with the learner. While you're doing that, you're setting up the expectations that you're going to be giving feedback. And this is really feedback is part of your educational relationship and really part of how you are going to help them be the best that they can be. And this is going to help build your credibility very quickly. And that's also going to help you when you have potentially some more difficult feedback conversations down the road. So, this kind of establishing rapport with the learner, how does this help us with credibility? Remember that recipients are perceiving, they want to perceive us as trustworthy. This action is going to help us demonstrate our intent to teach or help them. We're building our knowledge of them as a learner, who they are as a person and a professional. We're showing that we're empathetic and encouraging. We're working on that alliance with them. And we're actually demonstrating that feedback is a priority because we're telling them right off that, we're going to be working together and I'm going to be giving you feedback because this is how I'm going to help you improve. The next step is really helping the learners choose their goals. And this is setting that educational agenda. This is how you're promoting them, doing self-assessment and having a growth mindset. So we're going to ask the learners first, what are their goals? What are they working on? What are they interested in working on right now? You're going to help augment those goals if you need to, if they don't have any goals, or you think their goals might be too broad, or so you can look at the curriculum document, like for our merge rotations, that'll show you what the goals and objectives are for whatever experience you're teaching. And remember to use the growth mindset, the SMART format, specific, measurable, achievable. So really try to keep these goals manageable as much as you can. And so by incorporating their goals, again, for your credibility, you're keeping your feedback specific to their goals. You're promoting their growth mindset. You're demonstrating your intent to teach. You're getting to know their goals. So you're really reinforcing your knowledge of them as people. And then you are incorporating their self-assessment and their goals and expectations. So how does this look in practice? Very simple phrases like, I'm going to be your preceptor this week. And before we start, I want to get a sense if there's something you're working on, or is there something that I can help you with? So this, in a lot of ways, is very similar to how we pre-round or pre-chart with our patients. We are very quickly, we can break down the hierarchy. We're demonstrating our investment in their education, and we're encouraging them to have goals. And then the next step of feedback is observation. And this is really, you really hard, as we all say, you can't measure what you don't see or observe. And to really improve the specificity of your feedback, you really want to focus on things that you've observed. This is going to help you compare their performance against a standard. It really helps you localize the lesion if there's any deficits when you've really seen them in action. Really important to as much primary data as you can collect as possible versus what you hear from other people. And then just in terms of the tone of our feedback, the more that you've watched and observed, you can use I statements. I saw you do this, when I was there, versus you did this. That kind of the I versus you, it's much better received when you're saying these are something that I saw. Educational charting, just using a system to keep track of the learner's goals and your observations. And this could be old school, like a 3x5 card that you keep in your pocket, or it could be using your phone in the notes section. But just making sure that you're coming back to their goals, you're incorporating those observations that you've done. It's going to improve the specificity of your feedback. It's going to document progress and trends, and really shows your investment in their learning. Again, how does this help your credibility? Specific, objective data. When they know that you've observed them, you are much more trustworthy as somebody that provides feedback. It really demonstrates your intent to teach. It strengthens the alliance, demonstrates that feedback is a priority for you. And by watching them, you are really, able to say how they're doing versus the accepted standard or the goals and expectations. And then the next step is to have feedback conversations. And coming back to our definition of feedback, which was specific, non-judgmental information, comparing performance with a standard, given with an intent to improve performance. And the general principles here would be this is a dialogue. It's the old term that we use of giving feedback. We really want to replace that with having a feedback conversation that is part of an educational, longitudinal educational alliance and is goals based. Um, Best ways to give feedback in person, individual versus, as opposed to groups, timely, as close as possible to when you've observed. We're going to talk about, the ratio of positive to negative, but, delivered in a way that is empathetic and encouraging and incorporates their goals and self-assessment. There's a lot of models out there for giving feedback. I think you've probably heard a lot of these and used them. The feedback sandwich. There's keep, toss, add, R2C2. There's another one called Arch. There's a lot of different models out there. Um, what the podcast and the book kind of advocate, I think makes a lot of sense is they call the ART method, which is ask, respond, teach. So the first step is really to ask the learner, how do they think they're doing? And really specifically, what's your goal was this, and how do you think you're doing towards that? Using open-ended questions and active listening, responding back to what you heard them say, and use statements that demonstrate empathy, but just reinforcing, hey, we're in this together. Naming emotions when they're there. Yes, this was a very frustrating, it's hard. Apologizing, I wish I could give you more opportunities to do this physical exam skill or this procedure. Legitimizing, it's hard to be a learner, it's hard to be new, and then offering support. Little simple things like that will really reinforce your empathy in giving feedback. And then once you've done that, kind of teaching, offering your perspective based on observations and their perspective. One of the things they talk about is this, the reinforcing versus modifying feedback, and reinforcing kind of another way of saying positive feedback. And it's definitely good, make learners feel like you have their back. Everybody loves positive feedback and being recognized. It probably improves the learner ability to hear the modifying feedback when you've also given them something that they're doing well. The recommendations for modifying feedback or constructive feedback is to pick one or two at a time. And probably if you're offering any more than that at once, they're probably going to lose the message and just be overwhelmed by how many things they need to get better at. So, at any one feedback conversation, really kind of focusing on one or two areas at most. It's interesting. They talk about what's the proper ratio, and we've all remembered the feedback sandwich, and give two positive things for every one modifying. And they actually talk about in the podcast of there is some literature from other fields like psychology or marriage counseling that actually 4 positive for every one negative or modifying. So, but to not go way above that, because if you're giving way too much positive feedback and no corrective, they may not trust you either, that you're not really telling them reality. So interesting concept of what's the right ratio. And then the last step in the feedback conversation is to set new goals and expectations, and really set up the agenda for your next feedback conversation. So by doing that, we're reinforcing the growth mindset. We're reinforcing that feedback is a priority. We're maintaining that longitudinal alliance. We're promoting self-assessment and goals and expectations. Okay, we're going to shift a little gears for the last part of the talk and talk about some of the more difficult feedback conversations. And I think we're more comfortable, I think, in areas like patient care and medical knowledge, but I think a lot of where the hardest feedback conversations do come out of professionalism issues, or interpersonal communication skills. So I think as, a teacher and a former program director, these are a lot of my most challenging feedback conversations are when it involves these topics with learners. And, there's a lot of reasons there's conflict in our clinical learning environments. And I just listed, it's a chaotic work environment, high stakes, heavy workloads, long hours, complex schedules, handoffs, cross coverage, staffing, supervision, change. I mean, all these things, it's a very difficult work environment that we all work in. And a few things that I, have picked up along the way the last year through some of our program director school is, an interesting model called the SCARF model, which is thinking about how do we all end up in conflicts. And this was very interesting from, that social behavior can kind of be distilled down to things we do to minimize threat and maximize reward. And this SCARF model summarizes common factors that activate a reward or threat response in social situations. And I think about our learners and, status. They're really on this, beginning parts of the pecking order, and they're constantly thinking about how they are in our hierarchy of healthcare. Certainty, we all want certainty, but we work in a field that has a lot of uncertainty with, some days are busier than others. It's very unpredictable work that we do. Autonomy, residents and learners don't have a lot of control over their environment at times. Relatedness, we pop into a lot of different environments where a resident will just be coming into, or a learner coming into an office or a new clinical setting. They feel like they're the new kid in showing up to high school as a transfer student. Everyone else seems to know each other and I don't know them. And lastly, we all want fairness. And we're all variable in how we handle conflict. And, from the business literature, there's the conflict management styles, but everybody's different. Some people avoid conflict and they just hope that it goes away. Some people are very competitive and they want to win and they want to get their way, reject compromise. Some people are very accommodating and will yield to others and pick their battles. Some people will compromise and are very good at that, about meeting in the middle. But ideally, we are collaborating and we're really, seeking those win-wins. And then the last one, let me bring these up, is, this, how do we get to the reality of, or can we get to the reality of some of these conflicts and situations, and just the concept of the ladder of inference that, we're all, we don't always act on accurate information, and as we encounter situations, we're selecting data and information about what we see. We put meaning on that data. We make assumptions based on that. We draw conclusions, and that our perception of reality shapes our actions, but it's not always the same for everybody. So, sorry, and that our beliefs often affect the data that we select next time. So just the recognition that when we are giving feedback about conflict, that it's challenging to kind of get to what was the reality, what was the real situation. So some of my strategies for difficult feedback conversations is continue to use those relationship-centered communication skills. Hopefully you're building on a prior relationship. Continue to use your skills that build trust, active listening, open-ended questions, using that ART method. Avoid making assumptions from the beginning. Be aware of your own biases or the potential biases of people involved in conflict. As much as possible, find primary data over hearsay. Try to focus on the problem and not always the persons. People get very people are very defensive about when you feel like they're being attacked as a person. But if you kind of focus on, here's what the problem is. Perception versus intent. I think people get very, upset if they feel like you're imply that they intended to cause a conflict, and really just emphasizing that often it's not the intent, it's the way it was perceived on the other side. And then as much as possible, aiming for a constructive dialogue. So I think the first step when you encounter a really difficult feedback conversation is pause and recognize your own emotions, your own potential biases first. Be curious and humble. And is there any way that we contribute to this as teachers? Is there a way that something wasn't fair? Could we be wrong about something? think about, the following variables in your response of how urgent is this? How quickly does this need to be dealt with? What's the best way this conversation is going to be held? Is this an email? Is this an in-person conversation? Thinking about the environment, having these conversations in a private location. Are there other stakeholders that are involved or should be involved? Secondly is prepare and, gather the facts first, emphasizing as much as you can data over anecdotes, primary observations over hearsay. Is this a trend or a pattern, or is this just one incident? Do I have multiple sources that can kind of corroborate this versus it's just as one opinion? Thinking about the context, what are the circumstances and environment? Is this a crazy weekend where the EMR was down and there were 20 admissions and there were multiple codes going on? Does a learner have something going on, a new child at home or going through a divorce or something? And is this, what are their prior feedback, evaluations, self-assessment? Are there relevant policies at play here? And thinking about the parties involved and, what are their motivations, their interests, and their perspectives. So doing a little bit of preparation ahead of time goes a long way. Coming together and just defining what the problem was or is and establishing a goal that you're going to work together to solve the problem. Asking first, getting the perspective of the learner about what's going on, responding the same way, partnering, that we're going to partner together, recognizing emotions. I can see why this would make you upset. I can see why you were frustrated. Apologizing when necessary. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Giving respect that, you're working hard. I know you're working hard. Legitimizing that it's hard to be a learner, things like that. I think often coming back to common goals, things that we can all agree on: safe, efficient patient care, like the bottom of the screen there, institutional values. A lot of times, coming back to, hey, this is really not consistent with our values. We all want a respectful work environment or the educational mission. Thinking about these kind of conversations, a lot of things I just talked about kind of reinforce a lot of the things that are going to make the feedback more credible to the learner. This is an interesting article about, words and phrases to not use when you're in a difficult conversation. Don't exaggerate. I think people will get hung up on if you use words like you always, you never. It's rarely true that these extremes are true. So just trying to avoid, because people will just get hung up on, I don't always say that. I don't, that kind of a thing, and they won't hear the message. Be careful telling other people what they should do, and softening the language, like you might consider this, or one possibility is this, and instead of telling people what to do. Being careful about the words like unprofessional or unethical. Those can be strong words to people, so sometimes softening the language with detracts from our mission or inconsistent with our values is another way to phrase things that might be heard in a better way. Just be careful that our viewpoints may not always be obvious to others. So, being careful with words like clearly or obviously. And they recommend not to use the word "it's not personal," because when you say it's not personal, people think it is personal. So, and then lastly, in a difficult feedback conversation is wrap up and verbalize the action plan, your solutions, the responsibilities for each party, follow-up plans. Reflect on how you can prevent situations such as in the future. Express gratitude and empathy that I know you're doing your best, or thank you for meeting with me, things like that. And then often sending a summary communication afterwards to say, thank you for meeting me today. This is what we talked about. Here's our plan moving forward. So my summary, feedback is a core component of competency-based education, in particular for individualized learning and learner progression. At its best, feedback is a dialogue embedded within a longitudinal educational alliance with learners. Learner perspective of feedback credibility involves multiple variables that span the teacher, the learner, and the overall feedback culture. And that these relationship-centered clinical communication skills that we use for our clinical work, can be applied to feedback conversations, in particular, even our most difficult ones. So with that, I will stop and I will take any questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Tom, thank you very much. Such a great review, and I love that it was evidence-based. And of course, I love that one of my papers was the one you looked at, but that's just me. I think you covered a lot of great strategies for it. One of the things that I will add to that is focusing or just emphasizing that focusing feedback on behaviors that can be changed as opposed to personal characteristics that cannot be changed. So I think that's people get very, very sensitive to that. Does anybody on this call have any examples of difficult feedback circumstances that we could ask Tom to opine on? Really, all of your feedback interactions have gone perfectly?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Karen, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. I'm a surgical oncologist down at Mercy. I work with the LIC program, third year students, and a lot of PA students. And I don't know if this is the type of example that you had in mind, but just toward the end of the talk, I was thinking, I don't get into a lot of difficult feedback encounters with my students, but I'm also the chief of my division. And so when a surgeon does something they weren't supposed to, that is my conversation to have. And those are the ones that really challenge me and like get my heart rate going because, now it's a colleague, but a lot of what you said about difficult feedback at the end of the talk is incredibly relevant to those conversations, like and that type of thing ends up being, a case wasn't going well in the OR, and the staff are reporting that the surgeon became, irritable and the communication was bad. And, you know, just, maybe the patient did fine, but the experience that the staff had was really concerning. And now I have to sort through that. And so I don't know if that overlaps with what you do at all, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it applies to that kind of a work in maybe a practice management or leadership role. I think it actually, is a correlation with our clinical work too. And we have certain patients that get our heart rates up and we know encounters that are going to be more difficult. So it's the same thing. I think that's part of the logic of taking the pause first and really checking your own emotions and, why do I feel this way? What is it about
Yeah.
this situation? And I think with that kind of an example of let's say a surgical case is not going ideally, it's just, recognize having the surgeon or just recognizing what their outward appearance or maybe their tone or the impact it might have on other people. And it's often that the other people think that they're doing something wrong
Mm-hmm.
because of the way we act. And so really that kind of comes down to perception versus intent, that you're not intending to have this effect on other people, but it's how it's being perceived. And that's
Yeah.
how the perception versus intent, I've found to be a very useful strategy because people do not want to, they all say, I didn't mean to do that. I don't mean to have that effect. But it
Mm-hmm.
really is turns it around to say, I know you don't, but here's how it's perceived on the other side.
Yeah,
That's such great advice.
yeah, I think that's valid. I feel like I've had that conversation a few times without explicitly framing it in those terms. Yeah. Um, I, I tend to attend the sessions on feedback because I hate giving feedback. So I'll give you some feedback about your session. It was really, really good, and I appreciate the resources. I wrote down the book and the podcast, and I hadn't heard of those. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Karen, one of the things that I do in my role, I give feedback to program directors who, as a former program director, are really close to my peers. So I think I'm in a similar situation to you. And if I have to give back really difficult feedback, I actually put that right out, and I'm like, this is not what I want to be doing. I want to be talking about educational strategies or
Yeah.
doing this fun stuff, but I need you to hear this because of the perception of how this incident. I'm really curious as your perspective on this. So I just lay it out. I'm not happy to be here either. And just I love Tom's is that perception intent is really what is it that help me understand, right? Something you use with your teenagers. Help me understand this decision.
Yeah, that's a good parallel sometimes.
Any other questions out there? I feel like I should pick on Ross Hilliard because he's replaced me as internal medicine program director, but he might be still eating his lunch, I think.
Not eating. I don't know. I guess the one that came to mind, Tom, is a resident in the where I had to give the feedback about the fact that they were struggling to make sure that they had clean clothes and socks when they came to work.
Mm.
And trying to dig through like what's going on at home, what's going on as you figuring out your life. As we know, some of our residents, kind of enter real life for the first time as residents, and they've had lots of support in other ways until then, as well as a little bit of perception, but some of the reality of you kind of smell and we can't do that, and that's not professional, etc. So an interesting challenge. I'm not sure I did it well, but
Those have been hard. I've a number over the years where I'll receive comments about the resident's appearance or dress or things like that. Those are hard. I don't know that I love those conversations because, I think we're all individuals and how we dress, as long as meets a certain professional standard, I guess, but I think there's variation within that. And I was always a little wary about having the conversations about, unless the attire is really, out there and unprofessional, I guess. But I treaded very lightly on those conversations because I do think we're all individuals.
Any other questions for Tom? Well, thank you very much. Would you be able to, I just see something, would you be able to provide the name of the book and the podcast in the chat for reference?
Okay,
So,
yeah. And
Tom,
actually,
if you would do that?
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to, let me go back to my slide and I'll bring it up. There we go. Can you see that?
No.
Oh, sorry. Can't see it?
We can it just says questions.
Oh, sorry. Close your eyes for a second.
There it is.
There we go.
Terrific.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in September. And thank you for your support of the Merge Grand Rounds. Hope it seems that from the comments that this was useful. And Tom, again, thank you very much for preparing a very professional, evidence-based medical education Grand Rounds. Have a good weekend, everyone.